Highest murder spike recorded and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And I'm here, of course, today with our producer, Christopher Hopkins. This podcast is called Highest Murder Spike Recorded. And we do have a dumbest bill in America that is a bill hidden inside of the $3.5 trillion bill. Of course, there are literally thousands of bills hidden inside of that bill, as we all know. We'll get to that later in this podcast. But first up, the Ministry of Virtue and Vice. Sounds very Orwellian, and it sounds very Soviet, by the way. But of course, in Afghanistan, the Taliban has decided to replace the Women's Ministry, because there was a ministry there, and it was a women's ministry in Afghanistan. Then the Taliban took over, and they're replacing that ministry with an all-male Department of Virtue and Vice. So, female former employees reported being locked out of their workplace while staff working at a World Bank project for women's empowerment were escorted out of the building. Out of the building. The Taliban government in Afghanistan has replaced the Ministry of Women with an all-male ministry for, quote, virtue and vice in the latest crackdown on women's rights in the country. Tasked with enforcing the militant group's extreme interpretation of Islamic law, the department is thought to be a form of morality police. Female former employees reported being locked out of the building, according to Reuters news agency. The sign for the women's ministry building was covered by a replacement in a mixture of Dari and Arabic, reading Ministries of Prayer and Guidance and the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice on Friday. According to news agency AP, Taliban fighters inside the building said they did not know if another women's ministry would be set up. It comes as the militant group reopened schools for boys only, breaking a previous pledge that girls would be able to access education. The announcement did not say when or if girls could return to school. The move is reminiscent of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan in the 1990s, when a ministry for promotion of virtue and prevention of vice carried out public beatings and executions and enforced a strict dress code. Under the leadership, which lasted from 96 to 2001, women were not allowed to work or access higher education, and girls were banned from school. The move is part of the Taliban's creation of a new government as an attempt to tighten their grip on control of Afghanistan. Well, obviously, that's the purpose of it. And why are we talking about this, ladies and gentlemen, when this podcast has a title of The Highest Murder Spike Recorded? Because the highest murder spike is actually recorded in the U.S., and that happened because, of course, the cancel the police movement throughout 2020 and has continued through 2021. And we start out with the Ministry of Virtue and Vice in Afghanistan, so you can get a feel for some of the troglodytes that are now entering the United States from Afghanistan. Case in point. Case in point. Afghan refugees face federal charges after trying to rape a child, strangle a woman in Wisconsin. It's already happening. So 2 Afghan refugees were brought into the United States following Democrat President Joe Biden's disastrous pullout from the country, are facing federal charges related to allegedly trying to rape a minor and suffocate a woman. Yeah, allegedly, I'm sure. Barula Nouri, 20, is charged with attempting to engage in a sexual act, this is a guy, by the way, in a sexual act with a minor using force against that person, and with 3 counts of engaging in a sexual act with a minor, with 1 count alleging the use of force, the Department of Justice said in a statement. The indictment alleges that the victims had not attained the age of 16 years and were at least 4 years younger than the defendant. Mohammed Haroon Imad, 32, is charged with assaulting his spouse by strangling and suffocating her. The statement continued. The indictment alleges that the assault occurred on September 7th, 2021. The statement said that the cases were not related to each other, the Dow Jones added. Nouri and Imad were charged previously in complaints filed in the U.S. District Court. They made initial appearances in Madison, Wisconsin, a nice town, on September 16th and are being detained at the Dane County Jail. Nouri and Imad are scheduled for arraignment tomorrow. Oh, isn't that great? So these two Afghani immigrants, and they're, as far as I'm concerned, illegal immigrants, because the Biden administration brought them in without obviously having ever vetted them. So they're clearly illegal. Were brought into the United States, put in a really nice place in Wisconsin, not in any way vetted, and they commit these crimes. And now, instead of deporting them and sending them back to Afghanistan, we're going to process them through the U.S. system, legal system, and then they're going to eventually be what? Imprisoned? Imprisoned? I mean, we have to pay for these people to be imprisoned? If that's the liberal way of doing things, if that's the progressive way of doing things, wouldn't we have to imprison like half of Afghanistan? Because, I mean, this is like the norm with their men in Afghanistan. And of course, it hasn't stopped our federal government and the Biden administration for bringing a lot of these people in. So if you're going to wonder, podcast listeners, in any way, shape, or form, why we're doing this podcast of the highest murder spike recorded, because we're not even just talking about the cancel the police movement in 2020 and its carryover into 2021 and the legislation in various states across the country to do just that, to cancel the police and to defund the police. But in addition to that, we have the Biden administration and the Democrats bringing in people who clearly don't belong here and make our communities more dangerous. Why would you do that to your own country? And so let's prove what's already happening as a result of the cancel the police movement before we even talk about more illegal immigrant issues. Murders are up 30% in the United States in the largest increase on record. The largest increase on record. And this article just came out in The Hill magazine. Murders rose nearly 30% in 2020, representing the largest increase on record, according to analysis of FBI data by the New York Times. The forthcoming FBI Unified Crime Report is expected to show that murders increased around 29% amid the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, eclipsing the previous largest one-year change of 12.7% in 1968. So in 68, there was a spike, but of only 12.7%. But in 2020, the spike was 30%. The new FBI data showed around 21,500 murders in 2020, almost 5,000 more than in the previous year in 2019. However, the national murder rate, or murders per 100,000 people, is still about one-third below the rate of the early 1990s. Oh, yeah, right. Why would we go back to the 1990s? We're talking about year over year. About 77% of murders reported in 2020 were committed with a firearm, the highest share ever reported. According to the newspaper, the change was also not isolated to certain regions. Murders rose over 35% in cities with populations over 250,000, 40% in cities with populations between 100,000 and 250,000, and around 25% in cities with populations under 25,000 people. The FBI data is expected to be published Monday. According to the Times, the agency told the newspaper that while some numbers could be adjusted by then, the main conclusions of the data are unlikely to change. So, yes, podcast listeners, this is worth talking about. The highest murder spike recorded in American history, and layer on top of that, the Biden administration bringing in the troglodytes from Afghanistan. I'm talking about the men. I truly do, by the way, feel awful for the women and the children. But quite frankly, I think we should leave the men behind because I don't, I mean, these are people that are living in 7th century, 9th century mindset. And I just don't see them being able to, and I know there are always exceptions to the rule, but I don't see them as a whole being able to really assimilate into our country. Don't think it's a good idea. I see them getting very angry and very violent over time because they don't want to assimilate into the country because everything they believe is, for the most part, antithetical to Western civilization. So that isn't enough. That isn't enough. In New York, a suspect in a fatal hatchet attack, and this was just reported within the last 24 hours, was rearrested after release by the state's less is more law. So, yeah. So a man suspected in a brutal hatchet murder, suspected, yeah, was released from a New York jail on Tuesday as a result of a new state law before authorities rearrested him hours later, according to local reports. Democrats. This is how they run cities. Joseph Rivera, 21, was back in Monroe County Jail on a charge of second-degree murder in connection with the death of a 47-year-old Heather Majors, who was stabbed 30 times with a hatchet in her Rochester apartment on July 10th, WHEC-TV reported. Majors died from her wounds days later. I'm not sure how he stabbed her with a hatchet. I'm sure he hacked her with a hatchet. So Rivera had initially been arrested at Rochester's Tent City on July 22nd for violating numerous conditions of his parole, and police alerted New York State Parole that he was suspected in Major's murder, according to a timeline Rochester police gave the outlet. Police told Parole that Rivera was to be held in jail until December 2021, while investigators prepared for prosecution, and that he would be charged with murder prior to his release date, the report said. It makes sense to me. If you think that you're pretty sure that the guy murdered someone with a hatchet and hit him like dozens of times with a hatchet, why would you release them? I mean, what? Jeez. However, Rivera, the hatchet man, was released at 9 a.m. on Tuesday as part of New York's new law called the Less is More Act, according to police. Boy, this could be a dumbest bill. Under the parole reform law, which Governor Kathy Hochul announced on Friday, parolees can no longer be held in jail for technical violations. How is it a technical violation if you hatcheted somebody to death? Rochester police said officers did not know Rivera had been released until parole notified them an hour later. Investigators contacted the U.S. Marshals Violent Felony Fugitive Task Force, which took Rivera back into custody around 7 p.m. Tuesday without incident. Yeah, well, good thing he wasn't carrying a hatchet. Rivera pleaded not guilty in court on Wednesday, the Democrat Chronicle reported. He was being held without bond at Monroe County Jail. So, podcast listeners, this is the result of many years of liberal administration and governance of America's cities. Okay, Rochester, New York, got a guy, cut somebody up with a hatchet 30 times or so. The individual is a woman. She dies. The guy is put in jail, but he can't be held there because of a law that New York State passed. You know, you don't want to hold him for a long period of time until his court date because, you know, he's just as alleged to be the hatchet guy. I mean, so then he gets out. What do you think he's going to do? So he gets out on the street and you could be walking by this guy and not even know. You could be walking by one of the Afghani men who clearly do not know how to treat women. And I know that that is a general statement, but that's a general statement that's pretty much true. I mean, I have daughters. Would you want your daughter to walk by an Afghani man at dusk or dark in the middle of an American town, small town or city where Joe Biden has sent these individuals without notifying you? I mean, shouldn't we be notified? I mean, we're notified, of course, in our communities when someone is relocated there who is a sex offender because they're on the registry. And generally speaking, there are lots of state laws that require you to be notified. I mean, when you have Afghani men in your neighborhood, I'm sorry. If you have daughters, you have a wife, not a bad idea to notify the community that these people are there. And I'm not talking about the women and children. I'm talking about the adult men. The adult men. But it doesn't matter to the Democrats. It doesn't matter that we already have the highest murder spike recorded in American history as a result of the cancel the police movement in 2020 and 21. It doesn't matter to them. Let's bring in the worst people in the world to the United States. What are they going to offer us? and if that doesn't make the point, you know, the Biden cages, and we have this segment on the Biden cages. Ted Cruz lights up AOC and the Democrats on the Senate floor. He's speaking on the Senate floor about what's happening in Del Rio, Texas. And we have 3 clips on this. And we're going to play this because Ted Cruz is a terrific orator. He really is. He speaks really well. There's no doubt about it. He's very articulate. And what he's speaking to goes to what is happening, not just across the border in Mexico and in Central America with the cartels, but also what we're bringing into the United States because of a lack of vetting, okay? A lack of vetting. So first up, here's Ted Cruz lighting it up on the Senate floor. We had that first clip, and here it is.
I'll tell you, I've been to the border. I've been to the Biden cages. For 4 years, Democrats went on and on and on. The corrupt corporate media went on and on and on about kids in cages. You couldn't turn on the evening news without hearing kids in cages. What they didn't tell you is Barack Obama built those cages, and today under Joe Biden, the cages are bigger and they're more full than they were before. Mr. President, every Democrat who stood up and lamented kids in cages in the House of Representatives, Representative Ocasio-Cortez has a famous photo of her grasping her head by the kids in cages. Well, I'm going to give a simple challenge for Representative Ocasio-Cortez and for every Democrat in this body. Go see the Biden cages.
Yeah, go see the Biden cages. Will they see the Biden cages? Oh, no. Of course they won't see the Biden cages. And it's not just because of the narrative, podcast listeners, which, of course, you all know already, but it's because there would be a nexus between Democrats and the rise in crime in the United States, including not just violent crime, but the crime of illegal drugs like fentanyl killing thousands and thousands of Americans, which is coming across the border. We're not vetting these individuals. We don't know who they are. And Ted Cruz does a great job of not just calling out the hypocrisy, but also being more specific about what's happening at the border, because he is a United States senator from the state of Texas, and it is his responsibility to find out what's going on and to try to fix it. So how about Kamala? Ted Cruz says. We have that clip. Here it is.
Why does Kamala Harris, who's supposed to be the border czar, she's supposed to be in charge of this, why won't she go to the Rio Grande Valley? Because if she went, the TV cameras would come and would show the Biden cages. And the Democrats are counting on the corrupt corporate media to suddenly say, nothing to see here. 15,000 Haitians under a bridge in Del Rio, nothing to see here. Anyone want to know what Joe Biden's favorite ice cream flavor is? That's the news.
Exactly. I've actually spoken to that before this podcast, so I think it's pretty cool that Cruz brought that up on the Senate floor. You know, the idea that the United States media is not interested in what's happening really in the United States and on its border and elsewhere and internationally, but they want to know what kind of ice cream Joe Biden bought at the ice cream store. And that's how dummied down we are. You want to know how dummied down education is across this country, in particular public education? It's so dummied down that we actually have a media that has figured out that there's a significant part of our population that will be redirected when you start talking about the flavor of ice cream that the president of the United States likes. And you go, oh my God, that's so cool. I like chocolate too. Although I think Biden likes vanilla, or I know what he did. I think he did both because he's a politician, right? I like the swirl, you know, vanilla and chocolate. Well, here's Ted Cruz on clip number 3, talking about the media and other atrocities that are happening at the border, not by the border agents. Of course not. They're happening by the cartels and by a lot of the bad people who are in these migrant caravans. Here is the clip.
Never mind 1.2 million illegal immigrants. Never mind when I took 19 senators down to the border, we went out on the river and saw a man floating dead in the river who died trying to cross illegally. Never mind the South Texas farmers and ranchers, the moms who told me, I won't let my teenage kids go out on our ranch without being armed with a loaded firearm. Because there's so many human traffickers and narcotics traffickers that it's dangerous for them to go out on their own ranch.
Yeah, and remember that Beto O'Rourke wants to run for governor of Texas, and one of his part of his platform is to disarm the citizens of Texas. Can you imagine disarming the citizens of Texas, especially disarming the citizens of Texas who also live on the border? I mean, I don't know why anyone at this particular point in time in the state of Texas would vote for a Democrat. I don't know why anyone in the United States of America at this particular point in time, in seeing the way the country is being run, would vote for a Democrat. And we're actually going to talk about that in a bit of time when we get to the Biden dumpster fire, but we're not quite there yet. So Ted Cruz, he lit up the Senate floor with those 3 clips and then went on, by the way, podcast listeners, to talk about how many of the migrants crossing the border have debts that they owe the cartels. So they paid the cartels to be able to cross over Mexican territory and into Del Rio, Texas. But the cartels, when they got them like 3/4 of the way to the United States, said, you know that $2,000 you gave us? We actually want another $5,000. And then, of course, the migrant, the illegal immigrant, got to get that clear, by the way, illegal immigrant is saying, well, I don't have $5,000 to give you all the money I have. And that's when the cartel says, well, when we get you across the border, we need you to send us the $5,000 in payments over a period of time once you get a job in the United States of America. In other words, we have indentured servants coming to the United States who are illegal, who owe the cartels. And of course, the cartels are going to leverage that to get these individuals to do what? To help them sell and smuggle drugs into the United States. So Cruz talked about all of those issues and all of the human trafficking that's going on as well on the way. We don't vet these individuals. I have no doubt that some of these people are coming here for asylum and it's legitimate. And I have no doubt that most are not. Most are not. But one thing's for sure that they all have in common. They're all coming here illegally. So good for Ted Cruz for lighting up the Democrats on the Senate floor over something that is so hypocritical, namely that we don't have a media to report anything that's happening in the United States anymore unless it's about the kind of ice cream that Joe Biden is going to eat. And so we have also in Fox News, violent crime surged across America. This was just 22 hours ago, just yesterday, despite liberal attempt to rewrite the narrative. So, of course, as you can imagine, the liberals and progressives are now trying to rewrite the narrative. Oh, well, the crime didn't really increase. It's just because people, were upset because they didn't have jobs. It's like, yeah, well, you put them out of jobs during the pandemic because you shut down your economies in the various blue states, especially. But liberals are now trying to run away from this as fast as they can. I can tell you this, podcast listeners, in my own county in the state of Maryland, we have 2 gerrymandered districts, one in particular, where an individual clearly doesn't represent the best interests of the county. And the individual voted to cancel the police. She voted for all of the cancel the police legislation. And now, fast forward, now that it's 2021 and you can see the election of 2022 coming around the corner, now they're going, oh, I never voted for canceling the police. That's not what I was talking about. I didn't do that. Come on. Let me tell you something, podcast listeners. We as conservatives are going to remind the voters again and again and again between now and 2022, when the election is held, the midterm elections, as well as many state legislative races and state Senate races across the United States. We are going to remind the voters, we're going to remind them of the Democrats who voted to cancel the police. Because even if they lost their mind during 2020 because they hated Donald Trump so much, didn't stop them in 2021 from doing just that, canceling the police. We are going to remind the voters, and there will be hell to pay at the polls when we remind the voters that these individuals tried to make your neighborhoods less safe. And now we have the proof. We have the proof because we have the largest spike of murders in U.S. history. And so, podcast listeners, we have something kind of funny here. It's called the Doormat Democrats. So the Doormat Democrats, it's a term that was created by the Republican National Committee, and it is kind of interesting because the Republican National Congressional Campaign Committee is sending presents to 7 House Democrats. This is in the Washington Times. Those 7 House Democrats are facing tight re-election as congressmen and congresswomen, but the group probably won't get many thank yous. The National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, the campaign arm for the House Republicans, sent those 7 Democrat members doormats, which is what the GOP is calling these vulnerable incumbents, doormats. Quote, "We are sending doormats to these lawmakers to remind them that they let Nancy Pelosi walk all over them. Voters will hold any Democrat who supports Nancy Pelosi's reckless $3.5 trillion tax and spend spree accountable," said NRCC Chairman Tom Emmer. The moderate Democrats are under fire after portraying themselves as standing up to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi over that $3.5 trillion spending package being put together in Congress. All 7 said they would block the liberal spending spree unless the House first voted for the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package passed by the Senate. But they relented and voted to advance the massive bill after Mrs. Pelosi promised a September 27th vote on the bipartisan measure. In other words, they're not moderates. See, podcast listeners, this is the problem. I have so many friends on the right who say to me, you need to work with those moderates, because, that's how you create a coalition. Well, here's proof. You have people willing to spend the United States into bankruptcy, literally into bankruptcy. We already have inflation out of control. That's as a result of spending, overspending by the federal government. And the so-called 7 moderate Democrats whose seats are probably going to flip Republican next year. But certainly now that they're going to vote for this, they decided, well, we did promise that we really weren't going to support this crazy spending bill because we're moderates, but we're going to now. So the Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee said Republicans are just trying to draw attention from the benefits of the $3.5 trillion package, which includes measures such as child care subsidies and an increase in tax credits for children. Oh, yeah. It includes those 2 little things and then anything and everything else under the sun that's free for people. The NRCC is desperate to distract from the fact that House Democrats are the ones to thank for getting our economy back on track, while every Republican voted to block the very measures responsible for economic recovery. While they choose to invest in stunts, Democrats are fighting to invest in the American people, said Chris Taylor, spokesman for the Democrats. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Getting the doormat from the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee will be Democrat Representative Jim Costa of California, Carolyn Bourdeaux of Georgia, Jared Golden of Maine, Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, Kurt Schrader of Oregon, and Vincent Gonzalez and Henry Cuellar of Texas. Yeah, I think Henry Cuellar is gone. I mean, he keeps talking about the border, how outraged he is. But once again, it's all talk, right? All they've done, these Democrats, these congressional Democrats who know that their seats are in grave jeopardy in the House of Representatives, all they've done, and this is to the point, they say, we're moderate, we agree, this spending package is out of control, we can't support it, we believe in just voting for that really narrow, skinny infrastructure bill that's $1.2 trillion. We're not going to go for that $3.5 trillion thing. And now they've completely capitulated and said, all right, now we're going to vote for that $3.5 trillion bill. I mean, this is what is wrong with this country because people buckle under rather than doing what they know is right. Or are they just liars? Did they just lie to their voters last year when they ran for Congress and they told their voters, well, I just want you to know, I'm a moderate Democrat. I'm a moderate. And so now, folks, we need to start asking people what that means and give them examples. Well, if you were given a $3.5 trillion bill by Nancy Pelosi, would you vote for it? I'm sure they would still lie, of course, because ultimately all they care about is getting elected. So speaking of a Democrat that is in jeopardy, Governor Whitmer is trailing her GOP challenger in Michigan by 6 points. Now, Governor Whitmer, as you know, is that brilliant governor of Michigan who decided that you could go to a hardware store, but you couldn't buy seeds. You could buy certain things in the hardware store, but the other parts of the hardware store were cordoned off with tape, and you couldn't buy that stuff because somehow those sections of the hardware store might have resulted in you getting COVID. So Michigan Democrat Governor Gretchen Whitmer is trailing former Detroit police chief James Craig, this guy is awesome, by the way, by 6 points in a new poll released this week. According to a survey from the Trafalgar Group, Craig, a Republican, is leading Whitmer 50.4% to 44.4%. The poll found that 5.2% of respondents said they were undecided. Craig, who retired as Detroit police chief in June, so this guy's a Republican, he's the former chief of police in Detroit. After nearly 8 years as the chief of police in Detroit, announced his campaign as a direct challenge to Whitmer's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in Michigan. And so all kinds of tweets out there about this. Back in July, the Michigan legislature ended a law that gave Whitmer unprecedented power during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was a big mistake, by the way. The decision came after the Michigan Supreme Court decided that the powers granted to the governor were unconstitutional. Hundreds of thousands of our families, friends, and neighbors changed Michigan forever, and they decided they had enough and stood up to make a difference, Republican Speaker Jason Wentworth said. But that's not it. That's not the only thing. There's also a thought out there that Betsy DeVos might run against Whitmer as well. So the Whitmer campaign wants lots of money to defend against Betsy DeVos, but DeVos has not yet said whether she's going to run for governor of Michigan. So Michigan GOP billionaire Betsy DeVos, who served as education secretary under President Donald Trump, has made no public statements about plans to run for governor of Michigan. But you would never know that from reading the latest requests for financial donations sent out by Gretchen Whitmer's campaign. And so as you can imagine, Whitmer is playing on this. They're terrified of DeVos, podcast listeners, because DeVos supports what? School choice. That is her big issue. She is the most popular and famous and articulate candidate and individual in the United States on the matter of school choice. And she tried to work in that direction with Donald Trump. What she really needed was another term as education secretary, but unfortunately she did not get that. So now she might have an opportunity if she runs for governor of Michigan. So maybe she should run with the former chief of police, in Detroit. Maybe they should run together as a team. And if they were to run together as a team, can you imagine? You'd have a black governor, and then you'd have Betsy DeVos as lieutenant governor. She could spend all of her time as lieutenant governor pushing what? Pushing school choice in Detroit, Michigan. And then she would have a black governor to back her up and could speak to these individuals and say, don't you understand? This is in your best interest because now you can go to any school that you want to. Any school that you want to. I mean, it's unheard of. Imagine that. So we also, speaking of that particular issue, a teacher told students to hide an equity survey that they were giving. So a teacher gave these students an equity survey, and the teacher said, hide it from your parents. And this was to fourth graders. So after fourth grade, this is in the Daily Wire, after a fourth grade Minnesota girl told her school board that her teacher asked her to hide the fact that she was forced to take an equity survey from her mother went on national TV to blast organizations that impose their equity agenda on children, firing equity. I love this line, by the way, podcast listeners. Please remember this. Quote, equity is the mask that critical race theory hides behind. Really a great quote. Equity is the mask that critical race theory hides behind, said the mom. Haley Yaskar told the Sartell St. Stephen's School District Board, "Hi, my name is Haley Yaskar. I was in 4th grade at Riverview at intermediate school last year. I was asked to leave that equity survey. My teacher said that I could not skip any questions, even when I didn't understand them. One question asked us what gender we identify with." She's in 4th grade, podcast listeners. "I was very confused, along with a lot of other classmates. A boy in my class asked my teacher if his mom could explain the question to him because even after the teacher explained it, he still couldn't understand the question. My teacher told him that he was not allowed to ask his mom and we could not repeat any of the questions to our parents. I want the school board to know how uncomfortable this has made me. My mom always told me I can tell her anything. I can tell her anything, but she also tells me I can trust my teachers too. Being asked to hide this from my mom made me very uncomfortable, like I was doing something wrong. The school district had hired the left-wing Equity Alliance Minnesota to conduct an $80,000 audit on racial inequities within the school district. Alpha News reported, adding, quote, students were required to complete a survey for the audit. Haley told Fox and Friends, when I was in the survey, I was taking a few questions, and on the gender identification question, I got very confused and kind of nervous after a boy asked his mom, after the teacher explained it, that we could not tell our parents anything. This just made me very nervous and uncomfortable. So as you can imagine, the article goes on and on about the fact that fourth graders are taking an equity survey. And at the same time, the teacher, the one person you're really supposed to trust your child to for most of the day while you're working, the teacher says, don't tell your parents what we're doing. You can't tell your parents. You can't even take the survey home to show your parents. You have to leave the survey here and you have to fill out the answers to all the questions, even when you don't know what the questions are. Like, what gender are you? It's unbelievable. These people are sick. This is child abuse and they should be arrested. They should absolutely be arrested. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the Daily Biden Dumpster Fire. And that's true. We don't have music for the Daily Biden Dumpster Fire. But what we do have is some epic video about economics for dummies. So economics for dummies, of course, you know who the dummies are. The dummies are the folks in the Biden administration. So rather than having Joe Biden in his usual dumpster fire mode where you really can't understand what he's saying, or he just, can't remember the name of the Prime Minister of Australia or any other of the number of things that he does, we have instead Congressman Jim Jordan, who really summarizes the economics for dummies because he's talking to Dr. Holtz-Eagan in Congress, and he's questioning in open committee Dr. Holtz-Eagan. So who is Dr. Holtz-Eagan? You already know who Jim Jordan is. He's the congressman from Ohio. So Douglas Holtz-Eagan is the president of the American Action Forum. And of course, it is a conservative think tank. He's had many also jobs in government. Was chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And that was in 2001 and 2002. So that was during the Bush administration. He also served in 89 to 90 as senior staff economist. And in addition to that, he's also served at the Congressional Budget Office over the years. But he's been at the American Action Forum, which is a conservative think tank, for many years. So somehow the Republicans managed to get this guy in to Congress in a Q&A session in committee. And so we have two clips of Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan asking Dr. Holtz-Eagan questions about the Biden economics, otherwise known as economics for dummies. First up, we have clip number one. Here it is.
You'd laugh if it wasn't so serious. Mr. Holtz-Eagan, is the Democrats' economic plan working?
I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that the things that were done in 2020 were very effective on a bipartisan basis, and the things that have been done this year are not.
Right. The bipartisan CARES package PPP program worked, but in the last 9 months, we've went from rising wages to less purchasing power. Is that accurate?
Yes, inflation has exceeded wage growth.
Stable prices to not just any old inflation, 40-year high in inflation, right?
First half of this year, the 50% of the CPI basket that is food, energy, and shelter went up 10% annual rate.
Yeah. Energy independence, too. And we had the spectacle now of the President of the United States. 9 months ago, we were energy independent. And now we have the President of the United States begging OPEC to increase production. I don't think that's an economic plan that's working. In fact, I think it's dismal failure. He's nodding his head. Let the record show. The witness nodding his head.
Let the record show. The witness is reluctantly nodding his head. Yeah, this is kind of like economics for dummies. So I have the second clip, and these clips are just terrific. So they truly speak for themselves. And Congressman Jim Jordan, who is a rock star, here he is again, grilling Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Have you ever seen a dumber plan than the Democrats? I mean, lock down your economy, spend like crazy, pay people not to work, and oh, for the people who are working, we're getting ready to raise your taxes. Could there be a dumber plan?
As I said, we actually took the proposal seriously and ran it through something that looks just like what the Joint Committee would use for analysis, and it's a net negative for the U.S. economy.
Net negative, yeah. And American people are feeling it now. I mean, everywhere I talk. Let me ask you this. When you pay people not to work, should you be surprised when you can't find workers?
No one should be surprised about what's going on.
That's just epic. When you pay people not to work, are you surprised that there aren't enough workers? And when you pay people not to work, but then you raise the taxes of the people who are working, isn't that like economics for dummies 101? I mean, it just continues. I mean, Congressman Jim Jordan, by the way, that went on for many minutes, like 5, 6, 7 minutes. Congressman Jim Jordan is such a rock star, and he does such a great job in exposing and summarizing very succinctly how stupid we have become as a nation. And the fact that we, the people, just sit by and we allow these policies to continue. And I know what you're probably thinking. Well, Mark, what can we do? We can't do anything between now and 2022. Actually, you can do something between now and 2022. You can go and participate and get active in all kinds of groups across the country. You can get active in the Convention of States, which wants an Article 5 Convention of States to be able to limit the power of the government, which is constantly overreaching into your private lives. You know this firsthand because you've seen it during the pandemic. We still have the CDC running the economy. And so Jim Jordan speaks to these things. You can also, by the way, if you want to get involved, you can donate to political candidates that you actually believe in. You can work for those political candidates. You can also hold the elected officials that represent you to account. I say this all the time. Politicians are terrified of their constituents. Terrified. And if you let those politicians know that you are building up a base of support of people who want to hold them to account, those elected officials are much more likely to listen to you than to anyone else. And so I know we have serious structural problems, including economics for dummies in the Biden administration, but we have to do something between now and 2022. We can't just wait until September of next year. We can't just wait 1 year from now and just say, oh, now I want to get involved. Time to do it is now. It's the only way we win. So next up, podcast listeners, we have Go Woke or Go Broke. This is an interesting Go Woke or Go Broke. This Go Woke or Go Broke is called Blessing of the Solar Panels. Blessing of the Solar Panels. Now, I'm really proud of this because I really do a lot of research for this podcast and reach deep into all different kinds of media and all different kinds of communities and all different kinds of states. And I found this one, and I'm just like, this is Go Woke or Go Broke. So in Birmingham, Alabama, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Birmingham, Alabama, has decided to have a solar panel blessing by the bishop, the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama. So the Bishop of Alabama is to bless the solar panels at St. Stephen's in Birmingham. And this is in the Episcopal News Service, which is the official service, ENS, Episcopal News Service of the Episcopal Church. Birmingham, Alabama, September 21, 21. This little light of mine, quote, I'm not going to let it shine. I'm going to let it shine, excuse me. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine all the time. How do we accept the love and light of God and then reflect it back into the world? The answer to this question is, what powers much of parish life at St. Stephen's in Birmingham, Alabama? On Wednesday, September 29th at 6 p.m., a cherry picker truck will be parked next to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church on Crosshaven Drive in Cahaba Heights. Parishioners and neighbors will gather, eyes uplifted toward the sky as they watch the Right Reverend, yeah, that's right, the Right Reverend Glenda Curry, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama, rise slowly toward the roofline. So she's going to be in one of those trucks, the cherry picker truck, and she's going to be in that thing that takes her up into the air. And she's going to rise slowly in it toward the roofline of the church where they have solar panels. As she ascends toward the roof, a drone will be buzzing nearby, recording footage of the joyful scene below, children singing, This Little Light of Mine, a folk band leading songs of celebration, and a gathering of people from around Birmingham joining their voices together in prayer, giving thanks to the sun, the sky, and all the beauty and blessings of the earth. This article continues on, and I have to say something. That is not a religion, that's a cult. Okay? I'm sorry, Episcopalians in my community. This particular, as you probably have already known, if you're Episcopalian, the Episcopal Church is very broken. There's a huge schism in it, and you have a lot of whack jobs in the church. There's no doubt about it. And here's an example, right? Here is the Right Reverend Glenda Curry. She's the bishop of Alabama of the Episcopal Church, and she's there blessing solar panels. Blessing solar panels, which have nothing to do with God, which have nothing to do with religion, except that, as you guys know out there in podcast land, the folks who are really over the top about renewable energy, which solar panels are not renewable, but they think they are, and the people that are all about climate change have adopted this as a religion. But it's not the purpose of religion to adopt solar panels as a religion. We already know that there are people out there that believe that is a religion, but do we really need a traditional church, a long-standing Christian church, and an entire state to adopt the blessing of the solar panels? You know, whatever happened to giving people blessings from God, but they're giving the solar panels blessings from God. And it shows you that this is the ultimate go woke or go broke, because the Episcopal Church is like, they've completely lost their way. And I got to tell you something, podcast listeners. I know a number of Episcopal ministers. I know a number of them. And they are anywhere from conservative to completely and utterly nuts and out of their minds, and aren't in any way, shape, or form people of religion. They are people of progressive politics, and this is a great example of it. The blessing of the solar panels by the Episcopal head of the state of Alabama. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it is the dumbest bill in America, and it is tax breaks for union politicos. Tax breaks for union politicos. That's right. You get a tax break if this bill passes when you give a donation to your union. And by the way, it's not really a donation. It's your union dues. You are obligated to provide those dues in some cases. And when you provide those dues, that is not a tax break now under the tax law at the federal level. But the Democrats, this is in the Washington Free Beacon, are pushing for tax breaks for union political activity. The reconciliation bill has tax breaks for unions that fund Democrat campaigns. Once again, what does the reconciliation bill have to do with unions? Why shouldn't that be a standalone bill? So here is the article. House Democrats are fighting to give a tax break to workers, but only if they agree to subsidize union political spending, which pours billions of dollars into Democrat campaign coffers. The proposal, which is part of the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package, which is the massive spending bill, allows union members to write off up to $250 worth of their dues annually. So right now, whatever their dues may be, they are not tax deductible. But if this bill were to pass, $250 of their dues would be tax deductible. So you might have more people wanting to do what? Join the union. And then you might have the union say, well, why don't you just give us a little bit more money, because it's tax deductible. The tax deduction excludes dissenting workers who pay partial fees that do not cover political spending. Republican leaders and labor watchdogs said a tax write-off should include all labor union fees, not simply political ones, and should be debated as an individual piece of legislation rather than tucked into a massive funding bill. Well, there you go. The Republicans are finally getting a spine, saying, why don't we have this bill as a single subject bill? Why don't we have all bills as single subject bills? Representative Virginia Fox, Republican, North Carolina, ranking member on the Committee on Education and Labor, said Democrats want to reward labor unions for their consistent political support. Duh. Democrats' incestuous relationship with the union bosses is harming hardworking taxpayers, Fox told the Washington Free Beacon. This proposal blatantly discriminates against workers who choose not to join a union or don't subscribe to the left's socialist ideologies. Union bosses aren't getting a tax break. They're getting repaid for their loyalty to congressional Democrats and the Biden administration. Labor unions spent nearly $2 billion on elections and lobbying in the 2020 cycle, podcast listeners. I have to repeat that. Labor unions last year spent almost $2 billion on elections and lobbying in 2020, with millions in additional spending that watchdogs say is illegally classified as charitable on federal labor filings. Top labor union PACs overwhelmingly support Democrat candidates. Union members have the option to opt out of dues that fund this political activity, but in some states still have to pay fees to cover union representation in negotiations and grievances. The House proposal would only allow tax write-offs on dues that go towards political spending. So your $250 tax write-off would go only for that check that you wrote to the union, provided that it was used for political spending. Once again, using the tax laws to gain not just political advantage, but electoral advantage in money spending at the federal level. I mean, that in and of itself should be illegal, of course. And when you're a Democrat, you don't care. I mean, it's all about rigging elections. It's always about cheating. And the thing is, if you are a union member and you are only paying the fee that allows you to be represented, the representation fee, but you're not paying those other PAC fees for political purposes, you're not paying those, I can rest assured that as a union member, you're probably being discriminated against with all different kinds of job opportunities because they don't want you. The people they want are the people that are going to enrich the union coffers and make them more powerful at the national level. And so here's yet another reason, podcast listeners, yet another reason why the $3.5 trillion bill in Congress should never be passed. Because anytime you have a $3.5 trillion bill, you're probably going to have a few good things in there, and you're probably going to have tons of awful, ugly, evil things in there which undermine our democracy. And that is the dumbest bill in America. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.